For 2 more days the family came into the camp, the cubs scared and jumpy as I had never been seen, and was not surprised when Pippa took them back to the Molika plain. Since the last rains the grass there had grown dangerously high for cheetah, so Pippa spent a great deal of her time on trees, watching out for prey or danger. Once she shared the same branch with a large hawk who was waiting for the meat scraps, remained most of the morning in position, ignoring our movements right beneath him. He was totally ignored by Pippa. One day only the cubs came for the meat, while Pippa rested about 300 yards away. I took some food to her and patted her, but nothing would make her eat or drink. Instead, she was watching the plain most carefully and finally walked off, sniffing the air. I sent Local to investigate, but he found nothing that might have given cause to alarm her. As soon as the cubs realized that they were left alone, they got very upset. Big Boy seemed especially distressed, and I heard him for the first time uttering the same low moan which Pippa always gave when she felt worried about the cubs. While he and Tiny nosed their way in the direction in Pippa had disappeared, Somba grabbed all the meat she could hold between her teeth and only then trotted after them. The cubs were growing fast, and we had a tough time getting enough goats to satisfy their increasing appetites. Up to now, a boy had been in charge of a small herd at Kenmar Lodge, where he lived together with 2 caretakers and his family. But the lot had gradually become so derelict that it was now decided to abandon the building and withdraw the caretakers, as it would have been unfair to let the youngsters stay on alone. I had recently engaged an older man who has experience in defending stock with his spear. When he and his wife arrived, I instructed them that in the case of a predator attacking the goats, he was to report to me immediately and, if possible, provide us with evidence in the form of tracks of the predators or kill remains. All had gone well for a few days, until the herdman reported one morning that a lion had taken a goat the evening before, but as it had rained during the night, he could not trace a spoor in the morning to bring back the remains of his kill. 3 days later, he reported that 2 lions had taken 2 goats as soon as he had let them out in the morning. All the goats had scattered in the grass, and he could not trace them, fearing the lions might still be close. I drove to George, who came over and searched the area thoroughly until it got dark, but he could not find the spoors of either the stampeding goats or of any lion. We badly needed meat for the cheetah, so next morning I drove to Kenmore to get a fresh goat. I found the goats still locked up inside their hut, which had not been cleaned for many days, and the herdsman still fast asleep. Drowsily, he got up to clean the fields, while I followed his wife to one of the empty huts nearby. Inside it, I saw 3 goat skins pegged on the ground, a cooking pot filled with boiled meat, and half of a goat carcass hung up for further meals. No wonder George did not find the remains of a kill, let alone a lion spoor. I could sympathize with the man's anger when he found himself suddenly sacked and deprived of a life of leisure for which he was well paid, and one in which he was in sole command of a derelict lodge, and every second day got a free goat by blaming in disappearing on an imaginary lion. Until I could find a more reliable herdman, Stanley had to look after the goats, which meant that since Mary had also gone off for a week to Nairobi to settle some domestic problems which had developed since she arrived in Kenya. Local and I were left alone to care for the cheetah. We plodded after them. I laden with cameras, field glasses, a tape recorder, and a megaphone. Local with a meat basket, water can, and rifle, until we found far off on the Mulika plain. During the following days, they moved in a large circle back to camp. This was the place I wanted the cubs to get used to, but all the tricks I invented to entice the family away only resulted in their moving across the rivulet, where they settled for the next days around the Kil Acacia. One afternoon we found Pippa stalking a herd of 12 waterbuck. She almost got a fawn, but at the last moment was thwarted by its mother. It was very worried watching the antelope kicking at Pippa in defense of the fawn. Since adult waterbuck weighed up to 400 pounds compared with Pippa's 120 pounds, and they were therefore formidable opponents. Having failed to make a kill, Pippa turned up next morning in camp with Somba and Tiny. There was no sign of Big Boy. While I fed them, Local went to look for him and located him far beyond the Kilakatse. He tried his best to make Big Boy follow him, but had to return alone. We then scheduled the rest of the family with meat into returning to the Kilakatse to be within view of Big Boy. Although he must have seen us carrying the meat basket, he did not budge, and only after we had all walked up to him did not join us back at the Kilakatse. I could not understand his independent attitude, as he was only 8.5 months old, far too young to part from Pippa, especially when he was hungry, and hungry he was, judging by the way he now tucked into the meat. Somba had been very friendly while eating early in camp, but now she reverted to her aggressive food defense tactics and made such fierce attacks that I did not dare to move during the time the family fed. When at last even Somba could not hold any more meat, she followed the others to the thorn bush not far away, where they had gone to sleep off their full bellies. On her way she passed Local and Stanley, who had been sitting quietly in the grass. I signaled the men to remain absolutely still while Somba circled them and sniffed boldly at their heads. It was a tricky situation, since the slightest wrong movement from the men might have resulted in an injury, but both looked straight into Somba's eyes and betrayed no fear, however close she came. At last she seemed satisfied and moved on to settle for a siesta. Late in the afternoon, the family again appeared in the camp. I offered the cubs a little milk, and Somba behaved quite differently, despite my taking the bowl away from her while she was drinking, to let the others have their share. By next morning, the cheetah family had moved 3 miles from camp along the road to Leopard Rock. As soon as I bent low to hang the meat basket on a tree, Somba struck viciously at my head. It was fortunate that I was wearing my pit helmet. If I had not been, she might have scalped me. She then controlled every movement of ours for a long time, so that we could not feed the cheetah without being attacked by her. Finally, she put her head into the milk bowl, which gave us a chance to get quickly at the meat. After she realized that nobody was going to deprive her of her ration, she settled down. At times Somba could be a real little shocker, but she was also endearing in her efforts to resolve her conflicting reactions. She would unfeignedly cheer anybody who dared to move while she was feeding on her ground, but when she ate in a camp, she never made defensive gestures. Since she obviously differentiated between eating in a bush and in a camp, I wondered if she felt that within a human settlement she was not in her own territory. Whatever her reasons, I was determined to keep the family away from the camp and to prevent the cubs from getting used to people. Mozan was absolutely inevitable. Recently, I had often recorded the various cheetah sounds, most of which were strikingly similar to bird calls. Their high-pitched metallic chirpings in particular were like those of a bird. Frequently, I was misled by birds during my searches, believing their chirping to be made by the cubs. I repeatedly played back my recordings to the cheetah, and they hardly took any notice of their own squirrels, while at loggerheads with each other or their chirping or purring. But today, when I played back their fierce growls, which I had taped the day before, they all bolted instantly. We had had similar reaction from Elsa and her cubs, who had ignored the playback of their own sounds, but when they recognized the growls of the fierce lioness, their deadly enemy, they quickly ran off. At this time, George was looking after a little female lion cub, whose twin brother had been taken by a leopard. The mother was one of the lionesses whom George had rehabilitated, and though she had been a perfect mother, after the tragedy she had completely lost interest in the surviving cub. George had found her wandering hungry and alone, and she would certainly have died had he not adopted her. He named the cub Sandy and kept her confined within his camp. Sandy was a shy and wild little creature, and rebuffed all our attempts to make her friends with her. She would dash from one hiding place to another when she was approached, growling and spitting whenever George offered her food. As often as I could spare the time, I helped to feed her, while crawling under beds and cars, playing hide and seek with her between gasoline drums, or creeping through the maize patch which George Cook had planted near the kitchen shelter. I held out bowls of milk and small pieces of meat to her. Gradually, I gained her trust, even to the extent of being able to pull an occasional tick of her body, although I had to be careful not to overdo such familiarities. The only times when Sandy was happy and at her ease was when she heard a lion roaring far away, or when one of George's lions visited the camp. Then she would race up and down inside the wire, calling and putting her small paw over the meshes in an attempt to touch her kin, but it would have been much too risky to allow her to join the pride before she was old enough to keep up with the movements of adults. Also, the mother had shown scant interest in Sandy when she saw her through the wire. She had given no signs of hospitality. Therefore, some weeks later, George decided to let Sandy out in the presence of her mother, hoping for a reunion. As soon as the door was open, Sandy rushed joyfully to her mother, but instead of affection, she received a savage bite. Poor little cub! She crept away and hid herself in the long grass outside the camp, where George had difficulty in finding her and bringing her back into the enclosure. Now she had to recover not only from her wound, but also from the shock of being rejected by her own mother. It was heartbreaking to see, watching her mother through the wire, sitting resigned and quiet and giving no displays of joy as she used to do. But this did not mean that Sandy was reconciled to captivity. Soon two of the younger lionesses belonging to George's pride seemed to be taking a growing interest in her, and it was wonderful to observe how the bond between them developed, even though They were separated by the wire. Finally, Sandy took the law in her own paws and escaped to freedom and her friends. Sandy's determination not to become tame, as well as the reaction of Pippa's cubs to my camp, convinced me that one could help both lion and cheetah from becoming exterminated by bringing cubs up from the earliest age under natural conditions until they were mature and able themselves to breed wild cubs. Meanwhile, one morning Somba behaved more wildly than I appreciated, splashing the whole bowl of milk into my face. She was so savage that I wondered if she were a freak. But even if this were so, it would be the most interesting to see how Pippa would cope with her. Up to now, she had handled her amazingly well. The general believes that cheetah are timid and harmless compared with lion and leopard is justified only in that they are not man-eaters. Otherwise, they can be very dangerous and provoked. I once witnessed such an incident when I was visiting the Olduvai Gorge near the Serengeti. Driving out of the gorge, we saw an old Maasai supporting a boy who, covered with blood, could hardly move. From what we could make out the old man's excited chatter, the story was a gruesome one. The youngster had been herding stock when he saw a cheetah stalking one of the goats. Trying to defend his charges, he hurled his spear in a cheetah, but missed and found himself without a weapon when the cheetah turned on him. He then attacked the animal with his knife and got severely mauled while stabbing it. Finally, the knife got stuck in the cheetah's body and it ran off, leaving a trail of blood behind it. Hearing the yells of the youth, the old Maasai came rushing to his aid and saw the cheetah disappearing into a thicket far away. We took the injured boy to the headquarters of Olduvai camp, where his wounds were disinfected and dressed before he was taken to a hospital. I, of course, was interested to know what had happened to the cheetah and drove back to the scene. There we found several Maasai already circling the thicket with their spears and throwing stones into it to chase the cheetah out. When they asked me for a match to set the bush alight, I explained that I was a non-smoker and therefore carried no matches. Undeterred, they reverted to the ancient method of making fire by twiddling a stick against a wooden block until the friction causes the wood to smolder and it can be blown into a flame. While they were concentrated on doing this, I searched around the thicket and I was relieved to find no trace of a cheetah spoor anywhere near. Lately, Pippa had been rather aloof and reduced our time together strictly to her feeding hours. Before Mary's arrival, she had always shown her affection by brushing herself suddenly against me, spanking my neck, nibbling my hand in playful way, purring and looking with soft eyes at me when she was happy. In short, we both knew that we were pals. Now there were many people around and we were never left alone for such intimate. Whatever Pippa did, she either had a microphone held close to her face or cameras focused on her, and cars passed with strange people watching her through binoculars. Like Elsa, Pippa hated to be photographed and worse still to be sketched. Both animals seemed to be acutely aware of whether they were being treated subjectively or objectively. They knew when I looked at them for their own sake or if I was merely using them as a model, and this even through my outward behavior was just the same. Now I was painfully conscious that our intimate relationship had been injured. Of course I have brought Mary daily together, with the family only because I wanted them to make friends with her specifically, since I would soon have to go to London for another operation on my hand, and I hoped that by then she would have won the trust of Cheetah and be able to look after them in my absence. Explaining my recent estrangement from Pippa to Mary, we agreed that from now on she would stay with the family only during the feeding time, and afterward would sit in the car and read while I would follow them and remain with Pippa for as long as it might take to restore our old relationship. It was touching to see how quickly Pippa reacted the next day to our being alone together. As soon as the family had had their fill, they moved out of view of Mary and the man. I followed them and stretched myself between Pippa and her cubs, who cuddled up into a soft heap under a shady bush. After I had caressed Pippa for a while, she put her head close to mine and purred so strongly that I felt her body shaking with the vibrations. I knew that I was again accepted in her world, and was determined to guard our privacy from now on as carefully as I could. Pippa seemed to feel the same. Between it came along a ritual for her to share a time alone with me every day, and she was most cunning at securing this privilege. The family had lately remained within a mile of a photo tree where Pippa had got into the habit of resting on the roof of a Land Rover to escape the boisterous game of the cubs. They never followed her up to her lofty retreat, but after they had exhausted themselves in chasing each other around and wanted to go off to rest, they called in sharp, metallic chirping for their mother to come down. Zomba had by far the loudest call, and it needed no words to interpret their impatience when Pippa ignored her children's choir. One morning the cubs were most intrigued by something in the grass. Judging by their cautious movements and frequent regressions, I assumed to be a snake. Grabbing a stick, I then, with equal caution, walked closer until I recognized a monitor. This large but harmless lizard had had its retreat cuff off, and it all could do to keep the cubs at bay was to blow itself up threateningly, like a little dragon, while thrashing its tail and hissing so alarmingly that even I got scared in spite of knowing that it was only bluff. However, it seems that my appearance, in addition to that of the cows, was more than the monitor could bear, and so with unbelievable courage and speed it ripped off, hissing as it ran between the perplexed cubs. They did not pursue it, but it walked slowly away, as if nothing had happened. Later on they rejoined Pippa at the photo tree. Zomba was more friendly than I have ever seen her before, despite the fact that her gums, as well as those of Big Boy, were bleeding between the jova caninas and premolars. Tina seemed off color and behaved in a restrained manner. Whenever Pippa gently clouted him, as if to encourage him to take part in their games, he walked quietly away and watched the others with his large, sensitive eyes from a safe distance. How much he was like Billy when he was his age, and how similar my anxiety was for both. Maybe the cubs had teething trouble. They were now 9 months old, and judging by Pippa's previous litter, their permanent teeth should now be through. A few days later, locals spotted the family near the Hans Lager, close to where Billy had submitted to Pippa 5 months earlier. She had now definitely taken possession of her daughter's territory, but her own ground was no longer swampy, and there seemed to be no excuse for even a temporary occupation of Billy's area. Not long after this, locals saw Billy within 400 yards of a fodder tree, which also was in her domain. She let him come close enough to identify her clearly, but ran away whenever he came too near. So as not to frighten her away, he left Billy and came to get me, but when we returned, she was gone. From her spoor we learned that she had crossed the road before Pippa, and her cubs had walked along it to their daily playground at a fodder tree, where we found them, waiting for us. Poor Billy! She had obviously given way to Pippa, who had now resided in their territory for several weeks. Billy, Whitey, and Tatu were 2 years and 8 months old, and it was 14.5 months since I had fed all three together for the last time. Whenever we had seen them since then, they had been in excellent condition, and all were larger than their mother. One evening I found a young mouse bird in my sleeping hut. Not yet able to fly, it flapped and hopped clumsily about until I noticed that it used only one leg, the other leg being a mere stump. Quickly I lined a cardboard box with grass, placed the terrified bird inside, and during the night kept it close to me. Before dawn it started to cry. I tried to vain to feed it breadcrumbs and birdseed until I heard the call of its mother coming from a nearby thicket. I then put Stumpy as close as I could to the sound. The fleeting fluttered unsteadily and scrambled up into the thorny labyrinth, but soon it lost its balance and hung by its one leg, dangling helplessly upside down. When I rescued Stumpy, I was amazed at how calmly it accepted my help. By that time I had put down on the grass the mother had flown away, and though I waited for some time for her return, she seemed to have abandoned the chick. Now I tried my luck with feeding banana to the hungry little bird. This is like and took greedily from my hand. In the evening, while keeping it again inside the box near my bed, I watched it pecking vigorously at more banana, and so was glad to see that it at least Stumpy would not starve. Next morning it ventured straight to the thickest from where its mother was calling. Now for the next few days she took over the feeding, while I was allowed to rescue Stumpy whenever I found him dangling head down from a twig. Sharing the care of a little bird with its mother during the day and keeping it protected for the next 3 nights, one morning I watched it fly high up into a tamarind tree, where it perched well on one leg. When later in the day I saw it and its mother's flying off, I felt extremely happy to know that Stumpy was now strong enough to master life, even with only one leg. Less satisfactory was my experience with the tiny pinch-head-sized bugs which at that time suddenly invaded my camp. They neither stung nor bite, but covering the vegetation along the rivulets in thick layers, they ate every green blade and leaf until even the magnificent tamarind were reduced to wooden skeletons. Walking under the trees was like being in a snowstorm. The bugs dropped onto our hair, into the eyes, onto the typewriter and the camera, exerting a most unpleasant smell as soon as we squished them. Having been used to living all day in the open, now we became almost prisoners inside the palm log huts, except for the early morning and late afternoon when the stinkers were less active. Invasions by these bugs are rare in Kenya, but I had been warned that when they one took place, it would last up to 3 months or more unless the insects were sprayed with insecticide. However, as I did not want to poison the birds and other harmless insects as well, I put up with unpleasant bugs, hoping that the next rains would drown a lot.